Welcome once again to the deep dive. Grab your mask and snorkel because today we are skipping the standard cruise itinerary.
Uh-huh.
We're strapping on our fins to drop into some of the clearest, bluest water on Earth. We're heading to the Mediterranean Sea.
And we aren't there for the ancient history or, the famous islands. We're here to meet the silent, often unseen foundation of that iconic blue ecosystem. The one thing that, it keeps the water clear, the beaches stable, and all the fish fed.
It's a big job. And today we are diving deep into the world of Posidonia Oceanica, which you might know as Neptune grass.
Right.
We've stacked up some incredible sources that take us from high-stakes environmental litigation over coastal development in Monaco to these bizarre laboratory shock tests involving sunscreen and heat waves. Plus, we've got these detailed assessments of its critical role in storing what scientists call blue carbon.
So our mission today is to really thoroughly understand what this slow-growing, incredibly powerful organism does.
Okay.
And, how profoundly it is being destroyed by the very human activities that cherish the Mediterranean tourism, pollution, large-scale construction.
But it's not all doom and gloom.
Not at all. And this is the exciting part. We're also looking at how cutting-edge science and engineering are giving this ancient plant a genuine fighting chance. We're looking at solutions that fundamentally change how we interact with the sea.
Okay, let's unpack this. I think we have to start with a little adventure.
Let's do it.
All right, imagine this. You have finally landed on that perfect, sun-drenched beach. You're in Sardinia, maybe, or along the coast of the Balearic Islands.
The dream vacation spot.
Exactly. The kind of beach where the sand is just blindingly white and the water is so clear it almost looks like liquid glass. So you take a few steps down toward the waves, but then you pause. You see these strange clusters scattered all along the high tide line.
And you immediately think, wait, what is that?
Yes. What is that? They look like old, fibrous, brown tennis balls. They're roughly spherical, all tangled up, dense, and maybe a little abrasive if you picked one up.
Sometimes they're described as looking like coconut husks that have been covered in thread.
That's a great description. And most tourists, they look at them and they just wrinkle their nose. They assume they're just sea garbage, maybe plastic, maybe some kind of natural debris.
And that reaction, right there, that is the single biggest misconception about the entire Mediterranean ecosystem.
Okay.
Those strange clumps are known locally as Neptune's balls, and they are the visible, physical evidence of the invisible treasure we are discussing today. They are the slowly decayed sheaths and the tough, fibrous remnants of Posidonia Oceanica itself.
So we're not looking at algae or seaweed, which I have to admit is what I always assumed seagrass was.
Not at all. And that is the first, most crucial point to get. Posidonia Oceanica is not algae. It is a true, endemic flowering plant.
A phanerogam.
A phanerogam, okay.
A species that millions of years ago returned to the sea after evolving on land. Think of it like a rose bush or an oak tree. It has roots, it has stems, leaves. It even produces these rare little fruits.
That's fascinating. So it's a land plant that decided terrestrial life was, overrated and just went back to the ocean.
And it evolved to absolutely thrive in this hypersaline environment. Instead of a typical root structure that you'd picture for a tree, it uses these creeping, really tough, horizontal stems called rhizomes.
Rhizomes.
And they burrow deep into the sediment. And from there, it sends up those stunning ribbon-like leaves, which can be up to 1.2 meters long, that create this incredibly dense habitat.
Let's try to visualize this better. If we were to actually dive into a pristine meadow, like the famous one they found in Eremitas Bay near Corfu, what would we actually see?
Okay, so if the conditions are pristine, the visibility is just stunning. We often see these meadows extending from the shallowest parts, maybe just 0.2 meters deep.
So right at the shore?
Right at the shore, all the way down to 42 meters deep.
Whoa.
And that's only possible because the water clarity is so exceptional. So imagine you're flying over a terrestrial forest that's, say, 14 stories tall. But instead of tree trunks, you just have these incredibly dense, waving ribbons of deep, deep green.
14 stories.
Oh.
Underwater. That's just staggering. And what about the density? I remember reading a figure that just sounded impossible.
The density is what gives the whole ecosystem its power. We are talking about up to 10,000 individual shoots or plants per square meter.
10,000 per square meter.
Per square meter. So if you were to, say, lay out a small picnic blanket, maybe 1.5 meters square, you could potentially be looking at 20,000 individual plants rooted just underneath you.
Wow.
This density makes it less of a field of grass and more like a massive woven carpet of structural material.
So this is basically the architectural steel of the entire coastline.
That is the essential concept. We refer to P. Oceanica as an ecosystem engineer.
An engineer.
It doesn't just live in the Mediterranean. It actively and fundamentally shapes the entire environment around it. It captures, it stores, it filters, and it stabilizes.
Okay, so how does it manage that coastal stability? What is it actually building down there?
It's building that foundation we briefly touched on, the mat. So the rhizomes, those creeping stems, they grow horizontally, and they're constantly trapping the sediment that the big canopy of leaves slows down in the water.
Ah.
And over centuries, I mean, even millennia, this process creates this interwoven matrix of live and dead rhizomes, roots, and sediment. We call this the mat, and it can be meters and meters deep.
So the mat sounds less like a soft, sandy seabed and more like living concrete.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
It's what prevents coastal erosion. It absorbs the shock of waves and storms, protecting the beaches and, the coastal infrastructure.
Right.
And because the plant is constantly photosynthesizing and its canopy slows the water, it leads to these incredibly high local oxygen levels. It's basically the respiratory system for the entire shallow coastal zone.
And since it's trapping so much sediment, it must create some prime real estate for wildlife. I mean, what specific biodiversity are we talking about here?
It's the ultimate high-density, multi-story coastal housing. The meadows function as these crucial nursery grounds for juvenile fish and protected hunting grounds for the adults.
So it's a safe space.
A total safe space.
Mm.
We see these high concentrations of species like the painted comber, Serranus cabrilla, which is already classified as endangered,
Wow.
and the brown meager, Cyana umbra, which is listed as vulnerable. Organizations like ASEA in Greece, they confirm that where the meadow is healthy, the biodiversity index is orders of magnitude higher.
So, okay, let me get this straight. We're looking at an organism that is simultaneously stabilizing the entire coastline, acting as a lung for the sea, and serving as a critical nursery for endangered species.
Yep.
It is truly the backbone of the Mediterranean.
And yet, despite its incredible structural strength and importance, this powerhouse is under desperate threat. I mean, we are currently watching a silent, slow-motion catastrophe unfold across the entire Mediterranean basin.
Okay, give me the numbers. What are the stats that are keeping researchers up at night? How bad is the loss?
The data is, frankly, horrifying. Across its entire range, we have already lost approximately 34% of Posidonia coverage in just the last 50 years.
A third.
A third. Imagine losing a third of the Amazon rainforest in a single lifetime. That's the scale of the loss we are facing here, except it's happening silently, underwater where no one sees it.
A third of it gone. So why is something that forms such a dense, strong structure, this mat you described, why is it so vulnerable to human pressures?
It all comes down to its physiology. It's this strange pairing of incredible longevity with a glacial pace of growth.
Oh.
So recovery from damage is not a short-term process. We're not talking about a plant that's going to bounce back in a decade.
How slow are we talking? Give us the microscopic rate.
The horizontal growth rate of the rhizome apex, that's the little growing tip, is shockingly slow. We measure it between 1 and 6 centimeters per year.
Wait, hold on. 1 to 6 centimeters a year.
Okay.
That's barely half the width of my palm moving forward over the course of 12 entire months.
Exactly.
So if a boat anchor scrapes, say, a 2-meter wide path through the meadow, which sounds like a very common type of scarring, how long does it take to naturally fill that gap back in?
Well, if we take the highest estimate, the most optimistic one of 6 centimeters per year, it would still take a minimum of 400 years for that small patch to naturally recolonize and reconnect.
400 years.
Minimum. Its strength comes from existing for millennia, but its Achilles heel is its total inability to respond rapidly to acute trauma. When human activity inflicts rapid, large-scale damage, the timescale of recovery it doesn't match the timescale of the destruction.
400 years. That's not ecological recovery. That's geological recovery. It's truly irreplaceable in a human context.
And that leads us directly to the catalog of villains. The damage is cumulative, but there are these specific actions that are causing the most profound impact.
Okay, let's start with the most immediate physical trauma you mentioned, the anchor.
Uncontrolled anchoring, especially from pleasure boats and yachts during the high-traffic summer tourist season, is described in all the research as the single most destructive anthropogenic behavior.
The single most.
The single most. When a heavy anchor chain swings back and forth with the currents of the tides, it just acts like a wrecking ball or a giant rake. ripping out huge contiguous sections of the mat.
I can just picture that scar. It's just an instant loss of centuries of growth. Are there any regulations in place to try and stop this?
There are regulations, yeah, but they are often really poorly enforced or just flat out ignored, especially in popular deepwater bays where these large yachts tend to frequent.
Right.
And when they rip out the meadow, they don't just kill the plants. They mobilize the sediment, which clouds the water, and they expose the underlying mat to really rapid erosion and decay.
And the second major villain, you called it the construction crew.
Yeah, coastal development, port building, and dredging operations. These pose two major threats. First, there's the direct destruction when they literally cover or dig up the habitat.
Obvious.
Right. But second, there's the indirect destruction through increased turbidity.
Turbidity is when the water gets cloudy, right? How does cloudy water kill a plant that seems so tough?
Yeah, Oceanica needs sunlight, just like any other flowering plant. When dredging or construction stirs up all that fine sediment, it increases what's called the water's light attenuation coefficient.
A very sciencey term.
It just means less and less light can penetrate the water column. And if the plant doesn't get sufficient light, it can't photosynthesize efficiently, and it essentially starves or suffocates just very, very slowly. The leaves will just wither from the base up.
So the plant starves because we made the water dirty. And speaking of dirty, let's talk about the pollution two-punch.
The first punch is water pollution leading to eutrophication.
Eutrophication.
That's a nutrient overload, usually from agricultural runoff or untreated sewage. This creates the ideal conditions for these epiphytic algae to just grow like crazy. These algae, they cling to the Posidonia leaves and they block the sunlight, starving the plant.
So that's the classic weeds choking the garden comparison.
Yes. The second punch, though, involves heavier contaminants. Research has consistently shown that P. oceanica is an excellent bioindicator for contamination severity.
Why is that?
Because it has this incredible ability to accumulate trace elements. We are talking about heavy metals like silver, arsenic, cadmium, mercury, nickel, and lead. The plant just sequesters them in its tissues.
So it's the ecological canary in the coal mine, just silently absorbing all of our industrial waste.
Exactly.
This all sounds bad enough, but the stakes go global when we start to discuss climate change, right?
This is the definitive global risk. This is what links the local destruction of a meadow in, say, Sardinia to global climate change impacts.
Right.
And this is where we have to define blue carbon.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Blue carbon is the carbon that's captured and stored in coastal marine ecosystems, so salt marshes, mangroves, and critically, seagrass meadows. What makes P. oceanica so unique is the permanence of its storage.
The permanence.
Remember the mat. Because the sediment is so densely packed and the rate of decomposition is so slow, it often happens under what we call anaerobic or oxygen-free conditions, the organic matter just remains almost completely intact.
So because oxygen can't get down in there, the microbes that usually eat dead plants can't survive.
Exactly. The lack of oxygen inhibits microbial decay, which essentially preserves the dead plant material, including all the carbon it absorbed thousands of years ago. Radiocarbon dating on these mats shows they can persist for millennia.
Wow.
This makes them a true geological carbon sink, not just a temporary biological one.
So we're not just looking at a plant storing carbon from this year. We're looking at a vault of ancient carbon built over time spans we can barely comprehend.
Precisely. And here is the ultimate environmental penalty for all of this. If these mats are destroyed or degraded or exposed, say, by massive dredging or intense anchoring,
Right.
the sediment shifts, oxygen penetrates, and all of that ancient sequestered carbon is released back into the water column as CO2.
Oh no.
And this significantly exacerbates climate change. It essentially turns our most critical defense mechanism into a contributor to the problem. Protecting these meadows is equivalent to guarding an irreplaceable carbon reserve built since the last ice age.
That's the deepest, longest-term cost of our negligence.
Yep.
It completely reframes why we have to intervene.
It changes everything.
The stakes are just astronomical. So let's turn to the scientists, the modern-day heroes who are racing against this slow-motion catastrophe. Their first job had to be figuring out how to accurately assess the health of this incredibly complex system.
And that assessment, that's been the major hurdle for decades. Conservation efforts used to rely on older, much simpler tools. For example, there was the PREI index.
PREI, that's an acronym for the Posidonia Rapid Ecosystem Index, right?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And the PREI index was solely focused on the health of the plant itself. So, measuring shoot density, leaf length, or biomass. It was rapid and useful for a quick check.
Okay.
If the grass looked green and dense, the index usually gave it a good score. The underlying and very dangerous assumption was, if the goalkeeper looks good, the whole team is fine.
And we know, thanks to our analogy engine, that the goalkeeper might be perfectly fine while the midfield is giving up goals left and right.
Precisely. And that led to the development of a much more comprehensive tool, the Ecosystem-Based Quality Index, or EBQI.
EBQI.
This isn't just about the plant. It's compliant with the EU's Marine Strategy Framework Directive and looks at the functional health of the entire ecological community.
So how much more thorough is this?
It's exponentially more detailed. It moves beyond just the plant and looks at 21 different functional compartments or boxes that represent the entire food web and all the structural components of the meadow. It's holistic analysis on an industrial scale.
21 boxes. That sounds daunting for the average diver. How do scientists actually measure these compartments?
Well, they do dive, but they also deploy really sophisticated remote sensors and employ molecular biology. They start with the primary producers, the Oceanica leaves and rhizomes themselves, measuring biomass and overall health.
Right.
But then they move to the consumers, and this is where it gets really interesting.
Tell me about the consumers.
We have to measure filter feeders because their presence indicates water quality and pressure from human activity. The magnificent fan mussel, Pinnonobilis, is a massive indicator.
Okay.
If they're missing, it often means there's been trawling or heavy pollution. Then we measure detritus feeders like sea cucumbers.
Sea cucumbers.
Yep, Holothuria species. They process all the organic debris and basically clean the sediment.
So if the sea cucumbers are missing, the sediment is likely unhealthy or there's too much pollution killing them off.
Exactly. Then they track the herbivores. And they don't just count the grazing fish, like the Selema, but they analyze the specific grazing scars left on the Posidonia leaves.
Wow.
We need to know if the herbivory pressure is too high or too low, because either indicates an imbalance. And finally, we track the top predators, the larger fish, like various sea breams and sea bass.
So if the EBQI finds a good density of green grass, but say 0 top predators, what does that tell them?
It tells them the system is broken, but not necessarily because of water pollution or turbidity.
Ah.
It likely points directly to artisanal or recreational overfishing. The EBQI effectively separates the cause and effect of these different human impacts, which the old PREI index just simply couldn't do.
And what did the EBQI reveal when they applied it across a whole range of Mediterranean sites? Was this non-congruence, this mismatch, was it common?
It was alarmingly common.
All right.
They found sites where the older plant-focused indices gave a score of high or good. The plant itself looked fine, the goalkeeper was fit.
Right.
But the EBQI score was poor or moderate.
This sounds like a system that was lying to us.
It was. For example, in some areas, the grass density was excellent, but the EBQI score just plummeted because the abundance of filter feeders and top-level fish was near 0.
I see.
This confirmed that the poor functioning was being driven by things like intense boat anchoring and chronic overfishing impacts that are systemic but don't immediately kill the grass itself. It just demonstrated the sheer value of looking at the whole team, not just the superstar player.
That's the diagnostic tool. So now let's talk about the lab experiments that were simulating this apocalyptic cocktail of future threats. The study that combined sunscreen pollution with climate change heat is a masterpiece of dark foresight.
This was research designed to stress test the plant to its absolute limit, specifically looking for synergistic effects.
Synergistic meaning the combination is worse than the sum of its parts.
Way worse. Researchers in Mallorca, Spain, wanted to test 2 major stressors that will undoubtedly increase over the next 80 years. First, elevated temperature ambient plus 5 degrees Celsius, which is a worst-case scenario for 2100. And second, environmentally relevant concentrations of sunscreen pollution, 20 milligrams per liter, which is the concentration you might find near a really heavily trafficked swimming area.
Okay, elevated heat and lotion contamination. What was the initial result? I heard there was a fascinating twist when they tested the sunscreen alone.
Yes, the initial twist was completely counterintuitive. Sunscreen alone, when it was applied at ambient temperatures, actually caused a temporary boost in the plant's net primary productivity. It grew slightly faster.
Wait, I'm putting sunscreen on my plant and it gets healthier. How is that even possible?
The hypothesis was that the commercial sunscreen mixture itself contained these small traces of inorganic nutrients, ammonium, and nitrite, likely some residual chemicals from the production process. The Posidonia, which is typically nutrient-limited in the super clear Mediterranean waters, just utilized this influx as a quick energy source. It was effectively an unexpected dose of fertilizer.
Like giving the seagrass a shot of instant noodles, a temporary high-energy boost that isn't really good for it in the long run.
Precisely. But that temporary boost vanished immediately when they added the second stressor, the elevated temperature.
What happened when the heat and the sunscreen combined? The synergistic crash.
The combination caused this profound synergistic negative response that just pushed the plants way past their tolerance threshold. The first visible early warning sign was a massive drop-up to 50% in leaf chlorophyll concentrations.
That's terrifying. If you lose your chlorophyll, you've essentially turned off your ability to harvest sunlight. It's starvation.
Exactly. We call it photoinhibition, and it's driven by severe oxidative stress. The plant just can't manage the excess light energy under that high heat and chemical pressure, and its internal machinery starts to break down. But the most concerning finding involved the roots, the rhizomes.
What happened in the roots?
The combination severely inhibited the process of nitrogen fixation associated with the rhizomes. It dropped by over 50%. And this is critical because Posidonia is highly dependent on these microbial communities living on and around its rhizomes to convert inert nitrogen gas from the water into usable forms of nitrogen, like ammonia.
So the plant doesn't get its nutrients directly from the water. It relies on these tiny, unseen microbial workers in its root system to feed it?
That's the key. By combining heat stress and chemical contamination, the researchers essentially sterilized or inhibited the microbial workers that are essential for the plant's nutrient uptake.
I see.
So the plant wasn't just starving from the top because of chlorophyll loss, it was starving from the bottom because of the inhibition of its nutrient cycling. This just confirmed their incredible vulnerability to the combined pressure of coastal pollution and rising global temperatures.
That research provides a clear, chilling forecast of what we risk losing if we don't reduce both temperature rise and coastal chemical runoff.
So we have the diagnosis and we have the forecast. The plant is irreplaceable and the threats are compounding. The question becomes, when coastal development is absolutely necessary, what can we possibly do to save it?
And this takes us to the case study that rewrote the entire rulebook. The Principality of Monaco. An extreme example of development pressure, if there ever was one.
Monaco is a fascinating place to conduct an ecological experiment.
Sure.
It's tiny, it's extremely wealthy, and it has this massive demand for expansion. In 2014, Prince Albert II greenlit the massive Meadow development spring, 6 hectares of land reclaimed from the sea.
Reclaimed from the sea.
Yeah.
And as often happens with these massive coastal projects, a protected Posidonia meadow, 384 square meters of it, was directly in the way.
And historically, scientists had always deemed P. oceanica non-transplantable. Its deep root system, its slow growth, its reliance on that millennia-old mat. It all meant that moving it was considered a death sentence.
So what did developers usually do?
They often just destroyed the habitat and offered what we now call pseudo-compensation, so dropping artificial concrete reefs somewhere else, which is not an ecologically equivalent trade-off.
Right, because an artificial reef provides some fish habitat, sure, but it doesn't provide the structural integrity, the blue carbon sink, or the wave protection that the ancient mat does.
Exactly. The integrity is missing. But in this case, researchers, working with the development team, proposed a radical, unconventional rescue. They argued that failure was unacceptable and that a new, large-scale technique had to be pioneered.
This sounds like a high-stakes logistical nightmare. I mean, how do you physically move an entire, fragile, centuries-old chunk of seabed without it just shattering?
They pioneered a novel technique called sod, or clod transplantation. The crucial difference was moving the entire block of habitat plant, roots, rhizomes, and the associated substrate completely intact. They had to treat the meadow like a precious, mature tree that needed to be relocated.
And how did they manage the excavation? The logistics must have been insane.
The logistics are incredible. They used this specialized piece of equipment, a massive tree spade transplanter, the kind of thing you'd normally use for uprooting and moving huge oak trees on land. This spade was attached to a long-arm excavator that was operating off a jack-up platform, which is essentially a floating construction barge with legs that get anchored to the seabed.
A giant shovel meant for trees operating underwater to move ancient seagrass. That is truly high-tech ecological engineering.
The technical challenge was enormous. They had to cut out the turf and keep the integrity of that fragile, carbon-rich mat structure. They cut the 384 square meters into these manageable sections, placed them into specialized iron and cocoa fiber transport baskets, and moved the whole protected zone to its new location.
And how long did that take?
The entire operation, The extraction and the relocation took just 24 days in 2017.
24 days to move centuries of irreplaceable life. That's a logistical miracle. That moving something so complex has to inflict a tremendous amount of shock. Did the plants even survive the trauma?
That was the intense 8-year post-relocation saga. The initial years were extremely difficult. The researchers tracked a noticeable decline in shoot density for the first 2 years, 2018 and 2019, as the plants coped with the trauma and the continued stress from nearby construction work.
So vibrations and turbidity again?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you mentioned internal chemical stress as well.
Right.
The sediment issues were a major threat. In 2018, they found these alarming signs of anoxic conditions, a lack of oxygen in the newly relocated substrate. Specifically, hydrogen sulfide levels, HERs, rose above the lethal threshold in nearly half of the transplants.
HS. That's the toxic rotten egg gas, right? Produced when organic matter decays without oxygen.
That's the one.
So the roots were suffocating and being poisoned in their new home. This truly sounds like the entire project was just hanging by a thread. What was the probability of total failure?
It was incredibly high. Researchers were monitoring daily, just waiting to see if the entire carbon-rich mat would collapse internally. This is the biggest risk of pioneering the method. If the meadow died, not only would the plants be lost, but the released carbon would have completely negated their preservation efforts. But they pushed ahead, because the alternative guaranteed destruction was even worse.
But the recovery was spectacular, right? Once the construction pressure finally eased, the natural resilience kicked in.
It did. Once that intense construction phase ended, the transplanted meadow didn't just survive, it showed signs of full integration into its new home. The health indicators, chlorophyll content, nutrient uptake, they quickly aligned with the natural undisturbed meadows nearby.
That's amazing resilience, but what was the ultimate indicator of success, the real proof that it worked?
The ultimate biological victory happened just 3 years post-transplantation.
Okay.
The transplanted seagrass flowered.
Wow.
This is a really demanding physiological process that indicates a return to full reproductive health. And critically, they flowered in synchrony with the surrounding natural meadows, showing they were fully attuned to the local ecosystem signals.
That is a huge victory. And what's the long-term status as of today, 8 years later?
The monitoring reports from 2024 showed that the meadow has not only stabilized, but has actively grown. The transplanted area expanded by 25.8% beyond its original footprint.
No way.
This single project just shattered the non-transplantable belief and provided a verifiable roadmap for successful large-scale mechanical restoration.
That is genuinely inspiring. It's turning a historical failure into a blueprint for future conservation.
And the success of the Monaco project fundamentally changes the entire conservation landscape. This successful mechanical restoration of Posidonia on an industrial scale provides a clear, immediate pathway for saving protected coastal ecosystems globally whenever construction is unavoidable.
Which means this transplantation technique can no longer be seen as some optional extra or a voluntary measure for developers. It has to become codified policy.
Exactly. It creates a new mandate. This technique must be fully recognized as a relevant and necessary mitigation measure within the required avoid, mitigate, compensate sequence for all coastal construction projects. This is crucial for conservation policy.
So instead of being allowed to destroy a critical blue carbon ecosystem and offer an empty promise of compensation, the new standard must be, if you can't avoid the destruction, you must mitigate it through proven transplantation.
And it offers a legitimate, ecologically equivalent alternative to those ineffective pseudo-compensation methods, like just deploying artificial reefs. Transplantation ensures the preservation of the plant, its millennia-old mat, and all the associated flora and fauna. It keeps the ecosystem's integrity intact.
And this industrial-scale engineering is complemented by this powerful collective action at the community level, too, right? It's not just about jack-up platforms and giant tree spades.
Absolutely. The high-tech interventions are essential, but local mobilization is the engine of sustained recovery. You have organizations like ICEA through their Posidonia project, and they are meticulously mapping unknown meadows. They use this scientific data to build the financial case for protection, aiming for carbon finance incentives.
So if they can quantify the blue carbon value in economic terms, it makes it financially illogical for governments to allow its destruction.
It turns conservation into an economic asset. And on the ground, you have groups like Project Meadow who are organizing these community-based restoration networks, dive centers, local schools, volunteer groups, to mobilize people to replant stranded plants that have been ripped out by anchors or washed ashore.
And they are focusing on those rare, precious seeds, aren't they?
The seeds are vital. Posidonia only flowers and produces seeds about once every 7 years, which makes the seeds incredibly precious. But when those energy-loaded seeds are found, they have a remarkably high survival rate. So by teaching local communities how to identify, collect, and correctly replant those seeds, we can drastically accelerate the healing process in these high-trauma areas.
That acceleration is the definitive takeaway, and it gives us the hope we need. I mean, we calculated that naturally recolonizing a 28-meter-wide patch of meadow, like the one moved in Monaco, would take at least 400 years.
That's the staggering comparison to remember. The transplantation intervention, using that sod technique, accelerates that natural recovery to an estimated 15 to 20 years.
From 400 to 20.
That dramatic shortening of the timescale, from centuries to decades, is absolutely crucial in our battle against rapidly advancing climate change.
The message is crystal clear. The most ancient plant in the Mediterranean is finally getting the high-tech defense it deserves, proving that when political will aligns with scientific innovation, ecological restoration is possible, even for ecosystems we once deemed too fragile to move.
We have learned today that Posidonia Oceanica is a non-renewable geological carbon sink, the primary engine of biodiversity and the living concrete of the coastline. It is far, far too precious to lose.
Which raises one last provocative thought for you to consider as you finish this deep dive. We've quantified the carbon and the biodiversity, but we also now know that P. oceanica acts like an aquatic sponge. It actively filters the water and it traps microplastics within its fibrous sheaths, which then get washed ashore in those famous Neptune's balls.
And that unquantified service, the active removal of plastic pollution from the Mediterranean ecosystem, is arguably priceless. So what other unseen services might this ancient ecosystem be providing that we have yet to quantify? And if we can't yet measure the full extent of its gifts to us, what extraordinary level of protection do those mysteries demand? We have to act now because this plan is working harder for us than we know.
That's a powerful and essential question to leave with. Thank you for guiding us through this extensive deep dive into Neptune's grass, the true hero of the Mediterranean. If you want to dive into the specific research on the EBQI or the Monaco transplantation saga, you can find links to all the source material we discussed today.
Until next time.
Safe diving.